Okay, good evening. This is John Bushka. What I'm showing you right there is a picture from the demonstrations um, in early June of 2020, near Black Lives Matter Plaza. And today, what I want to talk about is diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's the Wikipedia page, but I just want to talk about the topic insofar as it affects my work and just give you a general overview of some concepts of what I think is really going on. Um, First of all, it is, even Wikipedia says it's essentially an organizational framework. So it is something that academic institutions and employers set up to manage their social acceptability and as far as dealing with the various problems we have, but particularly with respect to race and I would say not sexual orientation so much, but recently gender identity, especially those two items, but of course a lot of other things like disability and age and and religion and all kinds of other things. Now, of course, we've heard conservatives say, particularly DeSantis in Florida, say that what he wants is equality, merit, and colorblindness, EMC, like physics. And that's basically how I perceived the way the world was, particularly when I was working, particularly as my own IT career kind of climaxed in the 1990s and stopped at the end of 2001 after 9/11. Why isn't this working today? And I think it started to change in the middle of the 2010s, about the time Trump announced he was going to run for office, shortly after the Ferguson riots in St. Louis, and even while Obama was in office. Too many people just slipped through the cracks. Even though EMC did very well for many black people, and particularly gay and lesbian people, as we normally perceive them, started doing very well, certainly by the 1990s, generally speaking, as I did, to the point that we weren't really like a minority anymore or an oppressed group anymore. And we'll get back to that later. But it started getting worse in the middle of the last decade because so many people left, in particularly black communities, but not as much the other communities, indigenous somewhat, but of course other minorities did very well, like Asian and so forth. But particularly in black communities, the people left behind. Just like the title of that series on HBO, they were really left behind. There were really too many. So I also think the idea is personalized social credit, which you're hearing about from China. But if you really expected people to account more for what they have that didn't really earn, that would take care of a lot of the lack of what we call equity for minority groups. But that would help. But it's a lot easier for people to say they belong to identity groups, intersectionalized groups, and then develop activism along the lines of these being marginalized groups. And particularly disturbing is the idea if you create a marginalized group or draw attention to it and claim that it's unusually vulnerable, you can get free speech that is critical of that group shut down, especially when it's gratuitous and doesn't pay for itself like mine. You can use that tactic. It's almost like a group is almost like a country at war then, in a sense, and you don't tolerate people not being loyal to you, and it becomes authoritarian. I'm going to go over more of this when I talk about individual rights and my own plans for what I'm going to do in the future in a couple of weeks. But that's essentially the problem. Now, also it's true that many employers, many academic employers particularly, have required DEI statements from applicants. Colin Wright has made a big deal about that. I explained that in this blog post and included his video about that. But also, it's also true that some schools, like the University of North Carolina, have recently stopped requiring them, and not all schools do. But a DEI statement often requires a job applicant to state what they did, particularly for disadvantaged people, but they often are looking for what they did specifically for African Americans, and sometimes the TQI part of LGBTQ, particularly the transgender part, sometimes that comes up. But particularly, most of all, race. So we kind of follow critical race theory in what they ask for. They want to see that you've actually gone out of your way to help specifically people in a racial group. But if you actually look at the statements that companies have and that academic and most institutions have, they generally, when they talk about equity, they generally don't talk about it just in terms of race. They generally talk about it in terms of having people start in the same place in line, so you give people more consideration if they had more disadvantages and less privilege. And it's just, what do you call privilege? Is growing up in a stable home privilege? No, it shouldn't be. Is simply being white privilege? Well, it really shouldn't be just by itself, but sometimes it is. But most companies and academic institutions don't specifically say that, and they allow you to work around it and say what you did for people who were less fortunate than you. It doesn't always have to be about race. So I think the problem, the right has probably blown this up a little bit more than it really is as a real problem. If you have people actually giving people who are disadvantaged the help they need, hopefully the problem of equity, of getting results that are better, particularly for black people right now, hopefully that gets better on its own. But if it doesn't, then you're going to wind up with something like affirmative action and counting heads. And of course, you know that recently the Supreme Court nixed that. You can't count heads at all now. For a long time, there was some limited ability to. Remember, Justice O'Connor 25 years ago said, someday we won't need this. But it doesn't look like that someday came. And what we often see, which is very upsetting, is this kind of nihilism on the part of the left, in some actual companies, and particularly academic institutions, still segregating people and encouraging people to not, white people not to show their whiteness. There's a very good video by John Stossel where he's interviewing Eric Smith, who teaches at York College, and I think it's York, Pennsylvania, just across the border from Maryland. Been there, driven through there many times on Interstate 83, but I'll give you the link for that. And that explains a lot of the problems that are going on. Now, the other problem I wanted to talk about is, so we've talked about diversity and equity. The other problem I wanted to talk about is inclusion. And my own personal perspective of this is that that's more of a problem in the gender area than maybe the race area. And when you're talking about specific people feeling that they're not included, when we say that, quite correctly, according to science, that there are only two sexes, and that within each sex, biological sex, their appearance and their capabilities vary, there's a spectrum of bell curve of their capabilities within each biological sex, but it doesn't deny that you have a particular sex. And even in cases of certain DSDs or certain conditions that we call intersex, most of the time that doesn't result in the need for a person to regard themselves as transgender or to transition, although it can happen. And in rare cases, it can happen with youth. So that's one of the reasons why maybe some of these state laws are wrong. It can happen, it's just that it doesn't happen very often. And if it doesn't happen very often on its own, you would not need to politicize it in the classroom the way the left has recently, since in the past few years. You know, I hadn't actually noticed how political it was becoming until we were coming out of 9/11, even though it started maybe in 2017 or so. You know, people would say, I identify as, then that means I am. Now, in my own case, I identify with other men that are stronger than I am. So in the sense I mean psychologically, I identify with maleness, not with femaleness. But my behavior and my disposition when I was growing up might have led people today, if I got into a time machine, traveled 60 years, it might mean that I would be encouraged to try to transition. I would be very concerned. I wrote a piece about that also recently, and I'll give you the link for that. I think one of the reasons why this happened, particularly in the Obama years, from the 90s all the way through the 2000s, even through Bush, and then when Obama was elected, at the end of 2010, we did away with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and we had the examples of many service members in the military who were gay, and that helped. That certainly helped. That those stories and more of those should have become films and did. And I'm working on that, but more of them might become films, and I think that would have been good. And then there are many books, as you remember. Then in 2015, we got over Obergefell. We finally had the Supreme Court approve of protect gay marriage, calling it marriage, not calling it civil union, which takes some of the pressure off of people who don't have procreation through their relationships. And they specifically said it applied to using the word marriage. But that kind of opened the door for the left, I think, to try to, because you had to be able to mention, even in grade school, you had to be able to mention that there were if your teacher happened to be in a same-sex marriage, the teacher had to be able to mention it. And that kind of opened the door to thinking you could talk about everything, and you started seeing a lot of pressure from the left then to push the idea of gender ideology. And again, the reason gender ideology would appeal, now gender expression is fine. Gender expression is how you express is your behaviors in which express your own sense of your own sense of being having a polarity in a sense. That's more like the Rosenfeld's idea. Gender expression is not in itself does not create an identity category for political purposes. So we came up with the idea of gender identity, but the whole problem is it's very subjective, and we're using self-ID. If it was based only on when there was a medical condition, it was carefully limited like it was at one time, so that you wind up with adults occasionally transition, and there was a fairly low percentage, like there always was, compared to gay people. It wouldn't be a political issue, but it became, as we know, a political issue when we tried to assist kids, and with gender affirming care and so forth. My own position is mainly that should happen when it's medically appropriate, which is generally not very often, although it might happen. But it wouldn't happen enough to be politically important if you limited it to when it was really medically warranted. So, but the whole thing is then that the category, the identity group that you could say is oppressed, and that some companies like PayPal have said in dealing, with Colin Wright and his account of how he was banned and so forth in Etsy, that trans young people are an oppressed group, or gender conforming young people are an oppressed group, and especially vulnerable as a result of this. But I don't think that gay men and lesbians generally are, when they're normally cisgendered, as most have been all over the years, we would look at as an oppressed group in the same way. It's mainly the attention of youth that have issues with their gender, what they call their gender identity, and that's a sensitive topic. I didn't really want to pin it down. I can't really pin it down too much, except that I think we should be listening a lot more to the hard science than we are. But I understand if people can say I belong to an identity group, they may feel they're more likely to be included than if they have to compete and are known only by their biological sex, as some peoples have been saying. Reality's Last Stand, Colin Wright, and then Paradox Institute have been saying, which they're absolutely correct about the science, but the implications are that it would leave some people falling through the cracks and having a hard time. So I can certainly understand why people want to have gender identity, but that kind of gets beyond the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it comes up when you talk about inclusiveness in a personalized way, because otherwise people tend to get left out. So that's what I wanted to talk about this evening, and I do thank you very much for listening.